lovely to be in actually where I grew up. I grew up in Houston. I have a niece at Rice right now, and it's just lovely to be home, if you will. So today is going to be a session not about innovation itself or invention, but really about what happens after the invention or the technology exists. The so what? Now what do we do? And so it's going to be a little bit interactive. We're going to do a little Mentimeter. I'm going to give you some frameworks to think about, allow you to ask some questions, and then give you some concrete examples of how to apply those frameworks. So feel free to chime in, get your get your mobile phones out, your smartphones, because we're going to be doing a little interactive exercise on Mentimeter. Has anyone used Mentimeter before? It's just basically a polling exercise. Okay, great. All right, so why does market entry matter? Why do we think about market entry and the science around it, if you will? So the reason why many medical technologies never achieve impact is it's not a technical issue. It's actually rarely a technical issue. It's really about failure to plan for their adoption, use, and scale in low resource settings. So this is a graph that on the y-axis shows from 0 to 100% coverage across a technology. You really want 100% of the people that could benefit from your technology to access it. And on the x-axis, that's the number of years it takes to do that. So you see 0 to 30 years from launch that a lot of the technologies on this graph show. And you want the slope of that curve to look as much like a hockey stick as possible, so a really steep slope. And what happens is that a lot of times that slope isn't achievable. And so you have vaccines that could save millions of lives that don't get, that take 30 years to actually achieve market coverage. You have antiretroviral therapies, oral rehydration salts, really thinking about how do we get that slope of the curve to look like the very steep ones you see on the left. So that's why this matters, is that a technical innovation on its own doesn't really matter until it has the coverage that it needs. So I'm going to give you a job opportunity right now. You have been given the opportunity to choose between 3 tests that you can launch in a low resource environment. Test A is a big laboratory instrument that has extremely high accuracy, has a high capital cost, but actually very low ongoing consumable costs on a per test basis. It requires some infrastructure and space to use it in, and some trained staff at a hospital level to use. And it's a very exciting technology that this company that we're all a part of has just finished completing. Now, test B. Now this test is a little smaller than test A, has moderate accuracy, moderate costs, and it's usable at the health facility level. It's also a very exciting test. Nothing's ever been in this form factor before. And then there's test C. It's a rapid test that we might all be familiar with that format. It's fast and simple. It has a little bit lower accuracy than test A and B, but it's easy to use, it's low cost, at least, and it can be used at the community level. So you have the option to launch one of these products, test A, test B, or test C. I want you to get out your QR code here, your smartphone, scan this QR code, and weigh in on which job you want to take. Okay, that's good enough. All right, so who chose test A, test B, test C? All right, so the overwhelming majority, most people wanted to do the rapid. So actually more people than I thought wanted to do sort of the in-between. We're playing Goldilocks and the Three Bears here. And then one brave individual, and no competition for the job, is going to take on test A. Very, very interesting. Okay, so let's think about why we had this variation. Okay, so obviously I didn't give you, there's a room full of different answers. We have two factions plus a brave individual. So there's no obvious correct answer. I didn't give you any information about the market that you'd be entering, the country, the test, the disease, any specifics about the competition that might exist for this product. But we all had some preconceptions that allowed us to make the decision. Okay, so obviously test A is a big laboratory instrument and would require all the things I said, high infrastructure and high performance. And then test C is the rapid, probably can get out to a lot of different people. Each reflects a different definition of success, and the trade-offs in development exist. As you're developing a product, this is often sort of what you're trying to figure out what to make, some version of between test B and test C. But test A largely exists in a lot of the countries that I work in. But each is optimized for something different. Each test is definitely designed for its specific environment. So one thing I want you to think about as you're embarking on this launch journey, you've all been given the job you've asked for, is that launching is not a moment. And entering a market is not a moment. It's really a process that is full of forks and bends in the road, decisions at all the time. And things are constantly changing in a market, and just because you think you know what the market is last year, it's going to change between last year and this year. Early decisions, however, on product development lock in at some point. So the sample type you use, the power requirements, the form factor of an instrument, the consumables required, will you need a centrifuge for your test, or will you rely on someone else to already have that in their environment? Who's going to do the training? Is it you? Is it a piece of paper? Is it an association of laboratory technologists? So a lot of these decisions and assumptions need to be made up front and early so that you can actually complete the development of the product. And some of these choices are irreversible. They're early choices that are hard to go back on. So, but really don't think of this as a rocket launching and the person making the technology can shake off their hands and walk away. It really begins at the research and development stage and continues after the product launch. How do we make the best decisions possible to ensure that we can have an adoption curve that looks like this? And really, I'm going to present a framework that we're going to think about for the next 45 minutes. And it's really simple. And I'm hoping this is one thing that you just remember as you are making technologies in your life going forward. And that is, you need to think about the user, the chooser, and the pay the doozer. Okay, so I had to make it rhyme so you'd remember it. But really, the user is the person using the test, and I know that engineers often obsess about this particular individual or stakeholder. How do we make this test work for this user and solve a problem for this user? The other thing that sometimes people obsess over is the user. How do I get this regulatory approved? And sometimes they do this at the expense of the user. Maybe getting FDA approval is great, but it actually doesn't think about the choices that you need to make for your user. And then finally, and often the most neglected because it's the least understood, is the payer, the pay the doozer. Who is going to pay to scale your technology? So we're going to go through these 3 stakeholder groups and talk about how you were thinking about test A, B, and C, who you had in mind as your user, your chooser, and your pay the doozer. All right, so the user, the person who actually uses the test. So this is a person that could be a wide variety of personas. So it could be a laboratory technologist that has a high proficiency to move things, to process samples, to take samples, to keep an environment sterile, to clean it up. Probably your most technical user. You might have a clinician who typically acts on the answer that that laboratorian or that lab test provides, but they could also be your user. It could be a nurse, it could be a clinician that's also seeing the patient. You could have a user that's actually a community healthcare worker. So they might be a volunteer. They have some basic skills. Maybe they're a phlebotomist. They can collect blood, or they're comfortable collecting blood and have been trained on that. And they might be acting in a community type setting. Or you could have a home user. It could be you. You're the payer, potentially. You choose, and you are running the test on yourself. So there's a wide variety of users that you could choose from. And then also thinking about the setting that these users work in. Do they work in a hospital with where there's maybe 5 in the country, or are there 100 in the country? Do they work in health centers, which might be thousands of different healthcare workers that you're trying to access? That is a difficult group of people to train. Training thousands of people versus training a couple of dozen individuals that work in laboratory technologies. It's a trade-off. And finally, the community or home setting, even more scattered, even more disparate, a group of people to organize and to train on how to use the technology. And the setting that they're in, their infrastructure available, how samples get to and from those settings, how patients get to and from those settings, all vary. So when you were thinking about your user for your test, I'd like you to tell me and think about, using Mentimeter, who you actually had in mind. Okay, that's close enough. All right. So we had the one person who said the laboratory technician. That's great. But this is where it gets interesting. The Rapids and the Test B were a little bit split. So probably the home user, the community outreach, and the clinician. And that with the home user being the number one. Good. And then what setting did you have in mind for your test? Was it a hospital, a health center, or a community? Okay, good. That squares with the user. And then what's interesting, though, is a few people were thinking about a hospital that they had in mind, and some health centers. the number of dots isn't necessarily commensurate with the order of magnitude of these actual users that you have to reach. The community or home is going to be the most number of people that you'd have to actually somehow figure out how your test makes it to those people. The health center, a couple of hundred in some countries, a couple of dozen in others. And the hospitals, it could be a couple hundred or it could be 2 or 3. So thinking about how you reach each one of these dots is going to be really important. Okay, so for a feature that you think would be important to your user. Okay. Good. All right, so ease of use. Seeing a lot of easy to use, simple, ease of use, cost, accuracy was on there. Intuitive, cheap. A lot of these things are the same, they're synonyms for each other. But what I hear is the ability to use. And that squares with the rapids that you guys chose. The person that is actually going to be the target user for your test, it has to fit within their life, their workflow, the way they go about their day. Are you adding a test into their workflow that they currently don't do right now? And how is that going to work? Are you making their life easier? Are you creating more complication for that individual? Are you paying them more to run this test? How are you making their lives easier? And do they understand that? Can they see that? The speed and simplicity, you guys got all those acronyms. That's very important. But reliability and accuracy is also important depending on your user. And then finally, I've emphasized this a lot, that training burden. Who's actually going to train people how to use this test? Is it a sheet of paper, or is it actual, an individual, or a session of some sort? So that's the user. And I would say at the biomedical engineering program that you guys are in and working in, I know this program is teaching you how to do those things and then consider the user. And without the user ultimately liking this test, you're never going to get that curve vertical. It will take a long time to get people to adopt the test. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the chooser. So this is a government. It could be in the US, the FDA. It could be in the European Union, CE mark, a European regulator. It could be the WHO. It could be a technical committee in instances where there actually is no regulation. The country that you're operating in might use another country's regulation, actually, to think about what they accept in their own country. So really understanding what the regulation around your product is important. And if you're making a product for Malawi, but the purchaser of that is UNICEF and they won't buy anything that isn't approved for use in the European Union, you need to know that sooner rather than later. If you're making a product that has never, ever undergone regulation before, it's a whole new product category. This is the way we found AI in healthcare initially. What do you do with that? How does that get regulated? And so you can think about whether there's a lack of regulation as an opportunity, or you can think about the regulation as a really clear guidepost for products that already have existing similar products. I would just say that the chooser is oftentimes, one of the heads of the technical committee would be the lab person that we mentioned as a user. So if you think about that lab person, what types of features do you think that are important to them if they're the heads of the technical committee? So I like that cost is here from a chooser. I love the accuracy is very big, safety. Accuracy compared to the gold standard, assuming there is a gold standard. That's absolutely right. If there's evidence and standards that already exist, they're going to care about that. They really care about quality and risks. Are there policies they have around who can actually run the test in the country? Some countries, for example, won't allow a non-phlebotomist to collect blood, so you have to think about the volume of blood that you're allowing for collection. And then whether I mentioned the procurement is eligible. Are you pursuing a regulatory path that the people that are actually buying the test can actually spend money on that? All right, good. So the pay the duesers is the government, donor, insurer, or patient. And really, these are the people that are buying the test. They might not have the technical expertise. In fact, they might even be buying products, medical products, on behalf of the whole country. So it is impossible for them to be an expert in your particular test. Maybe it's a cervical cancer test or a sepsis test. It's impossible for them to be an expert across the board on every technology. So they're going to be really looking to the choosers to make a recommendation, and then they're going to go find a company that can make it in the scale that they need it. And it has to be cost effective, so they're probably going to do some cost effectiveness analysis. They're probably going to lobby for some funds to be used for that. How does this save money? Is it sustainable, and is it scalable? And this is a group that often is difficult to identify, and it's constantly changing. So in the HIV space, for example, we just had PEPFAR completely change the donor dynamic in HIV. And so the payer is very different now than it used to be. Even within HIV, it was always changing. So the point is that test A, test B, C, and is always a balancing act. Failure to adopt is not necessarily a failure from the technology itself, but a misalignment between users, choosers, and payers. So if you optimize for one corner, if you optimize for the user only and don't think about the chooser or the payer, you create risk for the success of your product actually getting to market. So for test A, the lab equipment, that limited our ability to reach lots of users. The payer doesn't like it because of the high capital cost up front to buy that big expensive equipment, but the chooser loves it because it's the most accurate. Test C allows multiple users, so many users to be able to use that test. It actually ends up being really expensive if you do scale to have 7 million rapids versus 7 million tests going to a centralized machine. So that would actually be more expensive. But oftentimes, that's something that the payer worries about when thinking about scale. The chooser doesn't like test C because they're usually a lab person at the head of the technical committee. And they don't like tests that are not as accurate as the ones they know how to use in their lab. Test B is sort of in between. The payer likes it because the capital cost isn't high, but it's still a little bit more expensive than the rapids. The chooser likes it because the accuracy and the performance are sort of middle ground, and the user there's certainly more users that test can open up to. But as you think about alignment of these users as you engage in your careers to make new tests, what happens if these roles are aligned? Basically, technologies sit unused, donor-funded pilots don't scale, and then you end up with equipment graveyards, where you've optimized for one corner of either the user, chooser, the pay the user. And in short, that's why alignment is really important, and not trying to be perfect, have a perfect technology for the user might result in the payer and the chooser not being happy. So I'm going to pause here for questions and then show you real-life examples of how you can balance what's important to these stakeholders through market research. So how do you balance what is important to different stakeholders? Well, qualitatively, you go find them and you ask them. Okay, so you want to sit down with your stakeholders and ask them what their preferences are. So it's really important that you pick out a user, and you might pick out that whole spectrum of users that I gave you, a home user all the way to the lab person. You might pick out 5 choosers, you might pick out 5 payers. That's going to be your hardest one, the payers, because they're probably going to like, well, talk to the choosers. Tell me what they want. But it is important to sit down with people and start asking them these questions. And when you start to hear the same thing over again, you won't at first, but when you start to hear the same thing over again, you have themes and buckets, you know you've done a good job on stakeholder interviews. So what do you do in these interviews? You can ask them what tests are needed. In this example, in KZN in South Africa, we sat down with the users, choosers, and pay the doers group, and we gave them a stack of innovations that they could have. And we asked them to order the cards in terms of priority. And this was a qualitative exercise, but what was interesting is all the qualitative discussion they had between ordering the cards. So that's one concrete thing that you could do to stimulate dialogue between these different groups. So what tests are needed? Get them to rank them. What tests are currently available in what format? It's really important that you understand the geography that you're thinking about entering and what's currently available. Map out the flow of the sample all the way to the result. Who are the different people that this test gets handed off to? This is an example of a central lab-based system in Zambia that was part of that trip that I met Rebecca on. Also, what challenges does that system create? So in the case of a centralized lab system, we observed that test results were taking anywhere between 1 and 16 weeks to get back to the place where the sample was collected. And the variation was wide across different countries. So figuring out what problem you're solving and mapping out the sample journey and the patient journey. Go to the environments that you're thinking. We showed you the hospital, the clinic, the community or home center. When you go to some of these, this is a measles immunization campaign. We were considering this as part of a setting. Can you imagine trying to keep up with the volume with one person running shots? That was the person that we wanted to actually run the HIV test at the same time. There's no way we could keep up with the volume at this site. This poor person wouldn't have had time. So is a rapid formula, we go to this and say, okay, we can't have a centralized lab equipment, obviously, in this setting, but the patient arrival at different facilities is really important. We actually went to a health facility and we asked, how many tests do you run per day? We went to lots of health facilities and they said, oh, we run like 30. We run 30, 34, 30, 40. Trust, but verify. We went to the lab logbooks and actually counted the number of samples they collected and found a very different number. So we found that on average, 60%, 97% of all tests were performed on 5 tests or less per day. So if we had developed a machine that could handle 40 per day, but really the majority of the clinics were doing 5 per day, we would have over-designed. Also, thinking about how your tests would fit in with existing workflow. The existing workflow at a clinic might be waiting area for the patient, then they go to the consultation room, then a lab, and then back to a consultation room, and then a pharmacy. Where in this clinic is your instrument or your test going to be placed? You can actually physically bring something with you that looks like the instrument you're making and ask them to show you where they would put that. Also, if you go into an environment, ask what the role of different stakeholders are. Try to identify who the users, choosers, and pay the duesers are. And what role do they play in piloting, approving, rolling out, or ongoing implementation. There's a lot of trade-offs that have to happen in test development, and really if you ask people what they want something that's affordable, sensitive, specific, all these things, but you're not going to get a test that's free, 100% accurate. Snap of a finger, you can get a test result in 5 minutes without infrastructure. The test rarely exists like that. So you will have to get trade-offs and make trade-off decisions. How do you do that? You can show people different concepts of tests and have a discussion with them. I like to provide people with very polar opposite choices, many choices, because if you just show them one, they're going to be afraid to tell you your baby's ugly. You really need to show them different versions of what you're thinking about making so that they can provide you some really good feedback and they can feel good about giving you that feedback. You can watch people use your test with simple instructions. Did they make errors on certain things? Could they train someone else how to do it? That's a great way to learn where usability isn't working. I did a lot of these things and was then humbled when I never tested out how hard blood collection was on a finger. And sacrificed all my fingers to learn that hard lesson. And it was very difficult to collect it in a specific type of collection device that we were using. And we ended up spending half the day on that instead of on actually running the test, which was much easier. So those are all qualitative examples of things that you can do to engage with users, engage with choosers, engage with people that will pay for the test. And you can find out different dynamics between the different groups by engaging them in a group, but you also want to make sure you do it individually, because usually there's a power dynamic that exists where there's deference to a certain individual in the room, which is instructive. But you also want to make sure that your user, the people who will actually be using your test, are giving you information, whether it's doing a demonstration of the product and you see the errors they make, or it's a real life setting, as close as you can to real life setting. So the other quantitative way you can do this trade-off balancing, I fought this quantitative way for many years because I like qualitative better, and you should always do qualitative first, but with surveys. So figuring out who your different stakeholders are in the demographics section of your survey, and then asking them to prioritize the setting that they would want a hypothetical new test to be in. In this case, in this survey, we got 41% really wanted health centers prioritized for an HIV test, and 36% wanted hospitals. We then created some hypothetical products based on 6 attributes and different levels of those attributes. So we basically generated, you can generate random products that you put in front of people on surveys and ask them to rate them on a Likert score. How likely are you very likely to use this or not likely to use this? And what this does is it allows you to understand the attribute and the level that's driving satisfaction. So if you're really stuck on whether you should be focused on accuracy or cost or sample preparation type or time, turnaround time, this is a way that you can put products in front of people and identify the relationship between those things. So we did this with 103 survey takers from 33 countries, and half of them were lab directors and half of them were other for an HIV test. And we asked them to rank these 12 random products that we put in front of them. And then we identified the attribute that was the most important for each of the settings and in each of the stakeholder types. So what was surprising to us is that the accuracy dominated not only at the hospital level, but at the health facility level. And then at the community or home level, that's when sample collection method and time dominated, depending on what stakeholder group you're in. Of course, we were left with, why did they answer these things? So a qualitative follow-up or a precursor would have been good for this survey. But these are just some examples of methods you can use to really tease out whether your product development effort is going in the right way. And it's not just for tests. This could be for medical devices. I think one of the most popular one right now being discussed is ultrasound, point-of-care ultrasound. So the user in point-of-care ultrasound is highly controversial, depending on what country you're in. In some countries, they don't want the user to be anyone but a stenographer that can actually provide something other than the sex of the baby, so that certain sexes of the baby would lead to eliminating girls, little baby girls. So there's a long history of that user challenge. The chooser, there's a lot of AI technology being deployed in point-of-care ultrasound to help guide where you should put the point-of-care ultrasound. And then the payer, like how do we actually make this work in all the settings that we want to? And that's highly variable depending on the different geographies. I think some of you guys are reading maybe some chlorhexidine cases where you can put this antiseptic gel, which is probably the simplest product you can use. But even that, you can put it on an umbilical cord and reduce sepsis in babies. But even that, some of the users in the early studies when that was being launched put it in the eyes instead of the umbilical cord. And so even the simplest products have some risk to it. I hope this is helpful. I hope that as you think about your own careers and product development, that you really think about these 3 different stakeholder groups and making sure that you're aligning for all of them and not optimizing for one at the expense of the others. I won't make you do Mentimeter again, but I want to just leave you with a couple of takeaways before we take questions. That market entry is not a moment. You don't get done with the technology and just hand it off to someone. It begins early and it really never stops. That trade-offs are unavoidable, and it may vary by user, chooser, and payer. And that really alignment matters more than perfection. So with that, I just wanted to give a shout out to a couple of things that were on my hard drive that are no longer available on the web. But if this type of work is interesting to you, this market launch work, there's 3 great resources that I've shared with the RICE team from my hard drive that can be shared with this group. But it's really thinking about going from idea to impact, or how do you launch a product, or how do you partner to scale a product, and maybe moving from an entrepreneurial outfit into sort of something that's more scalable. All of these resources are terrific. And with that, I will take any questions you might have.
Thank you for your talk. I'm wondering, who are the most common payers in low resource settings, and how do they quantify return on investment?
Great question. It really depends on the disease or the area. But I would say traditionally the most well-funded programs have been HIV, tuberculosis, and malaria. And I'll go into the payer dynamics a little bit on that and the history. So at first, it was the Global Fund and PEPFAR, sort of an amalgamation of different countries that were giving in to these 2 funds. And at first, Global Fund would give directly to governments then purchase. PEPFAR initially started giving to NGOs that wrote grants to then scale PEPFAR programming. And they later changed in many countries to give the money to the government directly. So that funding mechanism has changed a little bit given the decline in donor money there. But in the countries that I'm most familiar with, it's really sort of the government and NGOs. And it could be sort of a donation model for a lot of NGOs where they're donating things. But the good efforts are really trying to make sure the government procurement systems have in their budget and in the reordering mechanisms at individual health facilities or hospitals, the ability to order something off the government's catalog. So it really is a complex thing. We spent 2 weeks in Malawi trying to map what the purchasing of medical devices and consumables at the start of the NEST program. And it was in flux. I think also distributors are a really interesting group that often sell to the private hospitals in a lot of these facilities. And so really talking to the distributors about what they're selling and what they have a difficult time selling is also a really good way to talk to the payer. And then finally, there's some burgeoning efforts in different countries to get those, not formularies, but what they call them is health insurance schemes. So what would be covered under the government health insurance program? And if in the newborn space, like if we could get oxygen or CPAP or pulse oximetry or a bilirubin test reading covered, that would go a long way to allowing different mechanisms to scale, different groups to scale. But the payer is probably the hardest to map out.
And I want to build upon it. And I appreciate you answering or addressing the question of funding and payment. Are there certain mechanisms that you all use or techniques for internal cost analysis as you're developing the product to ensure that you're within a certain margin of affordability? And you may or may not have the answer right now, but out of curiosity.
The economics do vary if you're making one of something versus 100 versus 1,000 versus 10,000. The sort of the log difference really actually has a huge impact on the manufacturing facility that you set up. And so if you're able to better predict supply, you can optimize demand to meet that supply. And I think the best example of the way that this has been done is through Gavi and through CHAI and their coordination of the antiretroviral manufacturing market. So on the Gavi side, they were able to take procurement of vaccines at the individual country level, which, if you're a vaccine manufacturer, would take a lot of transaction costs to go country to country and lay out what they want to buy. So what Gavi was able to do is say, we will do the individual negotiation with countries on behalf, and we will take the risk, if you will, on over-ordering or under-ordering, allowing vaccine manufacturers then to optimize their manufacturing facility to get the lowest cost possible. And if Cambodia overestimated how much they needed and Thailand underestimated, it would level out. Like that over-ordering and under-ordering could be handled through the mechanism. So I think that's a good example of how vaccine procurement has been made more efficient. On the antiretroviral side, similar thing. CHAI took early leadership in coordinating the volume of antiretrovirals needed, and they coordinated across generic manufacturers in India and all suppliers of antiretrovirals to try to understand, if we produced at these different volumes, what price point could you hit? So I think that market coordination and that aggregator, if you will, is a really important role. And then I think from the demand side, I think the challenge is, what do I do with this $100 or $100 million that I have in my healthcare budget? How do I prioritize that? And I think, ideally cost effectiveness analysis would be used for that, but oftentimes it's political will and priorities of the constituency and who's active in the activist community. So I kind of hope that helped answer your question. Yeah.
You've seen a lot of innovators try and introduce new tech into low resource markets. Are there a couple of common mistakes that you see people make? And if so, what advice do you have to get around those barriers?
Sure. One is their product category doesn't exist yet. And so regulators don't know what to do with it. There's no existing predicate for entering the market. So you get stuck in the fact that there's nothing that exists like it. I think people also compare themselves to other technologies that already exist, but oftentimes they don't compare themselves to doing nothing at all. right? So you might have a test that could diagnose sepsis, and you could prescribe antibiotics for babies more judiciously. But are you going to pay $5 for a test when the antibiotic's $2? So that mismatch between stewardship for antibiotics and the challenge with using diagnostic equipment versus just treating. So I think people underestimate how much people just want to treat and not necessarily diagnose. So many mistakes that I personally made. I think overestimating the demand for something and how long this will really take. A lot of small groups have gone under waiting for people to buy their stuff. So yeah, so many mistakes, but so many successes as well. I had the opportunity to work as a summer intern at Abbott when the first rapid HIV 1-2 antibody test was coming to market. So we basically, when I started, PEPFAR didn't exist, so there was no payer. No one was getting tested because drugs were too expensive. And no one wanted to get tested because they couldn't access the drugs. So like, what's the point? Well, fast forward 25 years, and there's 90 million of those things that were being used, and people put on life-saving antiretroviral therapy. So I think that's an example of a success story. The things that make me really sad about right now is the rollback of that, but also the lack of funding for hepatitis and hepatitis B and C and HCV, HPV. So I think there's a lot of success stories, but it really comes down to that political will and deciding to tackle a problem and prioritizing it, and then creating stability in the market and allowing these technologies to scale.
The process you outlined for evaluating a device is like really labor intensive, and I'm wondering if there have been efforts to in literature to like generalize so you have a starting point for some of this. Like, are there certain kind of, if your test is screening versus like a acute diagnostic, you need to think about A, B, and C versus whatever, or is it still very much like individual product to product research?
I mean, I think in diagnostics, the assured criteria, the affordable, sensitive, specific, was an attempt to do that. But honestly, a lot of it is individual product specific. And I hate to say that, but there's a reason. This is one of the many reasons why skipping sort of the upfront qualitative and quantitative market research leaves a lot of folks that have worked really hard to innovate and create like groundbreaking scientific innovations, but the fact that none of the market work has been prioritized and or funded is a challenge. I think it would be really cool if we had an organized group of survey takers, people willing to take surveys. I think it would be really cool if there were sort of incubators where you could interact with healthcare workers and see how they use their test, how it works. And the thing that I appreciated is when specimen banks get organized. So for us, we were working on a point-of-care infant HIV test where the only lab in the country that collected whole blood instead of dry blood spots was in Cape Town, South Africa. So we basically found that lab and did our clinical trial there. But there were groups of people, particularly for neglected populations, if you can organize specimen banks that can help test developers quickly weed in or weed out whether this technology is going to work. But unfortunately, I think crowdsourcing the market research is really difficult. We've done this with my MBA students on behalf of product developers.
And like, if you could touch a little bit more on manufacturing and like as innovators, like the balance between thinking about like designing a novel design versus piggybacking a little bit on stuff that can be easier, like more easily manufactured, or just like how challenging is it to get a novel design manufactured?
Okay, so I have had the pleasure of working on several really highly creative, innovative thinkers that are they can't go into design freeze. They're constantly like changing the product, and that drives manufacturing people absolutely bonkers because they just want they want it frozen, they want documentation of every thought, idea, and how to then make it manufacturable in a consistent way. The first one we make is the same as the millionth. And those two personality types don't always gel. Having someone that can do the ISO 1345 documentation, but translate between the highly creative innovator and the very rigid manufacturer, I think is a really great skill set that requires someone who can understand both sides and has the patience and tolerance level for that. I know Rebecca and Marie have done that with several products. They've served as sort of that translator. But it's not always easy, especially if you're transferring a technology from an academic entity into like a large med device company. Those personalities sometimes can clash. I think there's a lot of great manufacturers in South Africa and India, and a lot of manufacturing that's popping up on the continent with probably some really great opportunities. But I think the R&D people, creative, innovative types don't like the documentation. The ISO 1345 is just brutal for them. Yeah.
I can't imagine any one person being able to do all of this. So what kind of, if you're trying to create like a starting team, who are the key people that you should have, and how do you go about finding those people?
Good. So it depends on the technology, but I definitely think the people that that I have enjoyed being on teams with are multidisciplinary. So engineer, probably some person with chemistry. If you're working on a test, some people that are used to working with liquids. The people that are good at manufacturing, the quality folks enter the room at some point. And then someone with market research / business acumen, and someone that's launched a product before. But sometimes you don't need to build this team yourself, right? Like this might exist with an alliance or a partnership. And that's why I like some of these pathways to scale documents, is it shows you a couple of different examples of partnerships that you could create. So you don't have to do it all yourself as an LLC or a .org. You can form partners with people. And it just has to be an equal partnership. So sometimes the technology folks will drive the conversation and they ignore the markets people. And so it has to be a respectful conversation. The other thing, I was talking with Canon about this today. We did this on our, we had 2 test development teams. One was molecular, one was immunoassay, working on the same product. And so they demanded to know the difference between the accuracy and the ease of use. They wanted the specifics. So creating competing R&D teams, like sort of on the same team, automatically creates a demand for market information to support whether they should proceed or this group should proceed.